Donc on va passer effectivement à ce dont Yves nous parlait à l'instant, ces classes moyennes qui contribuent à réorienter la production dans ces pays émergents qui pour beaucoup dépendent d'aide ou dépendent encore en grande partie des exportations. On verra comment ces classes moyennes peuvent aussi offrir des débouchés à nos entreprises et puis aussi une capacité à peser sur les choix de leur gouvernement de manière parfois déterminante. On va donc essayer de mieux comprendre le mouvement qui est en train de se dessiner avec cette troisième et dernière table ronde de la journée intitulée « Les classes moyennes émergentes, les clés de la réussite ». Et j'appelle à me rejoindre sur scène Catherine Girard, économiste corporate chez Renault. Également François Hesbourg, qui était déjà avec nous ce matin, conseiller spécial à la Fondation pour la recherche stratégique. Zena Latif, économiste et partner chez Gibraltar Consulting à São Paulo. Et Natalia Zubarevich, professeur à la Moscow State University, directeur du programme régional de la Moscow Based Independent Institute for Social Policy. Et avant cela, eh bien, une première présentation d'Amitabh Kundu, professeur d'économie à l'université Jawaharlal Nehru de New Delhi. Professor Kundu, please proceed to the podium for the first slideshow. Thank you.
It's an honor and privilege for me to speak to this galaxy of experts on comparative risk assessment across countries. I note that India is being mentioned several times in the context of the Eurozone crisis, and I must mention that most of the Indians recognize the fact that India is an emerging economy with a sense of pride, but also with a sense of responsibility. Shifting of the focal points of economic development, and as the World Bank would call it, the epicenter of urbanization from the north to the south, particularly to India, China, and Russia in the coming 2-3 decades, has been accepted as fait accompli. And yet, India, creating the largest middle-class consumer market, overtaking United States and China in another 2 decades, can be viewed with a legitimate amount of skepticism. This is because most of the predictions are based on the assumption that as growth takes place, the distribution of income or consumption remains more or less the same. Now, if that is the case, how do I move forward? Can we go to the next? Yeah, it's okay. Can we go to the first one? Now, if the assumption is that the distribution remains the same, and the economy, as the economy progresses, ultimately you will have a large percentage of households in the category of $10 to $50. But we know that this assumption that with economic growth, the income distribution remains the same is wrong. We know 10% richest households in India accounted for 18% of the total consumption before 2 decades. Now they account for 42% of the total consumption. Also, I must mention that many of the assumptions that have been fed into the model by the bank and also Asian Development Bank to give the 7% rate of growth for Indian economy for the next 2 decades can be questioned, particularly the capacity of Indian economy to withstand the global crisis has been questioned. This year, IMF has lowered down our growth rate from 8% to 5%. Also, India has to make a massive investment in skill development because India is lagging behind China, and if you want to take advantage of demographic dividend and also the youthful population, that investment doesn't seem to be coming. And final point that I would like to mention, that in many of the projections it is assumed that the consumption basket remains the same for the rural areas, small towns, and large cities. That really overestimates the total consumption expenditure. Given the limited time, I would just look at this projection that have been made by Brookings Institution, by McKinsey Global Institute, and also many others, that India will have 30% share in the total middle-class consumer market by 2030, whether this is overambitious, particularly because the rate of growth of urban population in India is slowing down. Also, there is a very high concentration of population in large cities, 5 million plus cities or million plus cities. And I must mention that the latest data do show that the people living in the large cities do not spend as much money on consumer durables as the small and medium towns and also in the rural areas. So one would have to make corrections to that effect. Now, India has massive amount of literature on poverty, and poverty goes into the policy formulation immediately. But because of the conflicting vested interest within the middle class, government has never defined, nor the researchers have defined the middle class in clear terms. Earlier in the 90s, they said anyone above poverty line belongs to the middle class, but nonetheless, that has been questioned. There are people like Angus Deaton, Martin Trevelyan, Abhijit Banerjee. They take $2 to $8 or $10. That really takes, by that definition, Indian middle class will be nearer the poverty line in Europe. So what we do is to look at the global definition generally used, $10 to $50 per capita per day, and let's see where India figures. There are large, can we go to the next one? Yeah, these are the figures which have been given by different studies, and you do find that India figures really at a very low level as far as the present middle class is concerned. Maybe you can go to the next one. You see that India has 2 million only compared to Brazil, compared to China, compared to Russia. This is absolutely a small middle class at the present moment. There are many other studies which give slightly higher figure, but they take different kind of database. But nonetheless, on one point, there is absolutely no disagreement that presently, Indian middle class is a very, very small percentage of the total population, less than certainly 5%. But there is one point on which there is absolutely total agreement, which can go to the next slide. We know that the growth rate is phenomenal, but all the projections that we see, you find that the middle class, even if you take the income earnings, you find that the middle class is going to grow massively by all projections. We go to the next slide. We know that Economist magazine has predicted that Indian middle class is not going to grow incrementally. It is going to increase exponentially. And the market consumption in India would be increasing faster than the number of households or growth in income because of the high consumption elasticities for consumer durables. The World Bank and the Brookings Institution predict that the increase in the number in the total 2 decades would be 1,200 million at the global level, and India will claim 10% of it. We go to the next. We know that the importance of the Indian middle class is not just because it accounts for 60 to 70% of the globally traded consumption, but also because it has a high savings rate, high investment rate, and it renders socio-political stability into the system. I must say, I was hearing in the morning that there is a possibility of any immediate war or conflict involving India. I think the Indian middle class interest will strongly resent and protest about that. Indian middle class is techno-savvy, modern, Western-oriented, globally aspiring, with a high consumption scope for discretionary spending, because the excess of income with the basic consumption is pretty large. It is hungry for product differentiation and nuanced quality. Many say this distinguishes Indian middle class from that in Latin America and Africa. It wants instant financial services, and investment product. And all these characteristics of the Indian middle class, which are the distinguishing features, would create massive opportunity for global business for Western producers as well as the local producers. Now we look at the next one, please. The middle class, I must say, demands withdrawal of the state and opening of the market to consumerism. And that's why I would like to say that no matter which political party wins the election, I do not think that protectionism will come in the agenda, because the middle class demands consumerism. As Dr. Zlotowski mentioned, that the middle class wants political stability, it wants withdrawal of the state. For 3 months in India, there was massive protest by the middle class against the state operators on the grounds of inefficiency, corruption, and poor service delivery. But paradoxically, this middle class has the power to get the support and corner the subsidies on the basic items like food, cooking energy, power, petrol. And also this middle class has a vested interest in maintaining the informal sector at very low wages, which allows both husband and wife within the family to work in a global sector and match the Western timings, because the domestic responsibilities can be taken care of by the informal sector as a domestic help. Informal sector also in a way subsidizes the formal sector because it produces the intermediate products at a low price, which gives the formal sector a competitive edge in the global market. And I must say, middle class is also successful in converting many of the anti-poverty program which is targeted to the poor. It expands and opens it up, and middle class is able to enter that so that they can also get the benefit. You can go to the next one, please. Now, the question is, do you think that the middle class will be able to maintain its political position? Despite its small size, it's an opinion builder among vote banks. It has linkages with print media, electronic media, civil society, and also it has an edge in knowledge and access to technology. It has networking with bureaucracy at different levels, and therefore I do think that middle class will be politically and socially powerful in the next few decades. But the problem is, there is dualism. There are conflicts within the middle class itself. Next, please. We find that out of the total middle class, as defined by $10 to $15 per capita per day, 30% is in rural areas. 35% is in small and medium towns. Only 35%, remaining 35%, is in million-plus cities. Please do not think that consumerism and the middle class strength is only in the Mumbai, Delhi, and 30 big metropolitan cities. The small and medium towns have large consumer demand, which often gets ignored. And the conflict is coming up because the middle class in the large cities do not allow the middle class in the small towns and villages to enter the cities, because they have created all kinds of residential welfare association, and that is the kind of conflict. Access to jobs in the big metropolitan cities is also determined by professional and technical management institutions, and these institutions have restricted entry for the rural middle class. And as a result of this conflict between the middle class in the big cities and small and medium towns, the rate of growth of urban population is coming down. That is the point that I wanted to mention. We go to the next graph, you see that the percentage of growth rate of urban population, which was projected by United Nations in 1995, was much higher for India for the period 2025 to 30. You see the tall graph, which was predicted in the 90s, but gradually the projected figures for the same year, 2025-30, has been brought down, which really means that the growth rate of urban population is declining. Similarly, the projected figure for 2045 to 50 in different rounds of the UN projections have gone down. And another disturbing factor is that there is excessive concentration of population in large cities, 5 million plus cities. We can go to the next slide. You can see that percentage of urban population living in 5 million plus cities in India is 23.5, whereas for Europe, it is only 7.5. This is the percentage of people living in 5 million plus cities to the total urban population. Now, the high-powered expert committee in India talks about creating 87 million plus cities from 32. And I think if you create this top-heavy urban structure, this is going to affect adversely on the middle-class demand, because growth in the mega cities, please do not think the 10 million plus cities or 5 million plus cities are going to give a big boost to the global business, since the demand for consumer durables is much less in the big cities compared to the small towns and villages. And that comes out in the next graph. You look at this distinction, you do find that the tall bar on the right-hand side, the rural consumers are consuming much higher proportion of durable goods, which include furnitures, electronic gadgets, air conditioners, washing machines, much larger in per capita terms compared to the small towns. And the big cities, that is shown by the orange mark, they consume the least. If you look at the big cities, you find their consumption expenditure is more on rent, fuel and light, beverages, petrol and gas, and many consumption services, domestic help, dentists, lawyers. So basically, they generate employment within the local economy, whereas expenditure in the rural areas and small towns, non-million plus towns, generate income in the consumption market. I just would like to conclude by showing two sensitivity analysis. Can we go to the next graph? This is a graph given by Brookings' projection and also McKinsey's figures. I tried to tally that. What does this graph show us? The green space is that for India, which is second from the bottom, and that it is projected that by 2030, India's figure will be higher than that of United States and China. I did a sensitivity analysis, take the same model, and I fed a lower growth rate of urban population. As I mentioned, that the growth rate of urban population is declining as recognized by UN, and that decline in the growth rate will also affect the growth rate of the economy. The moment you feed that, you find the next slide, the total consumption demand goes down because the growth rate of urban population is now taken to be low. Also, the fact that if there is a massive concentration of population in the 5 million plus cities or million plus cities, that would also adversely affect the total middle class consumption, and also the desired investment in skill development may not take place. And I feed in these two factors, and I do again a sensitivity analysis. The next graph shows a reduction, further reduction in the middle class consumption. I would like to now conclude by showing the last slide. Yes, we can go ahead. Don't have much time. I had thought that I would mention that, well, the demand may go down, but after listening to the presentations from my colleague in the morning, I feel really, when I look back at the Indian experience, I turned myself from a pessimist to an optimist. I would like to say that Indian census has predicted that the possibility of growth in small and medium towns is pretty high. The concentration may not be in the large million-plus cities where consumption demand is less. And the government of India's policy of inclusive growth may not conflict with the promotion of the global market. And that is the optimistic note with which I would like to end my presentation. And my final word in one sentence would be, a massive opportunity awaits global business in small towns and villages in India. But that's not a matter of 2012 or 13. You have to have patience, at least for the 10-year period. Otherwise, this massive opportunity that exists would be lost. Unless that's my appeal, that the inclusive strategy of development very much provides for growth in the consumer durables and the global business, provided we are making the right kind of investment in the right areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.